Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today on this presentation on disaster planning for libraries. So like Kelly said, if you have a question, please just type it into the chat box. I will try and pay attention to it and answer it as we go. If I don't and I miss it, please remind me again at the end and I'll try and answer it there. So without further ado, let's begin. So presumably, if you're here, you have some idea of why spending time on disaster planning is important, but oftentimes it can be hard to convince other people, especially supervisors. The general reasoning for not doing disaster plans usually runs along the lines of, we always have so much going on, there are so many things happening right now that need our attention. You know, why should we bother to worry about something that hasn't even happened yet when we're so busy with what is happening? And the best answer to that, the fancy answer to that, is that pre-incident preparation is critical to maximize the success of salvage in the limited time after the incident, before which existing damage will rapidly deteriorate. And the answer that's easy to remember is just, it wasn't raining when Noah built the ark. So if you plan beforehand, when something does go wrong, you don't have to waste a lot of time figuring out what to do next. And that's going to be the point that I make a couple of times during this presentation as to why this is so important, is that the more time you spend beforehand, the easier it will be when something does go wrong. And, you know, eventually something will probably go wrong, because that's just the way things are. So let me give you an example. Alice goes downstairs to the special collections basement to check on the thermostat. She hears a funny sound, and when she turns the corner, she realizes that a pipe is burst and that all of the boxes and manuscripts on the lowest shelf level are getting flooded. Alice immediately starts trying to move the boxes out of the way of the flooding. So this is an example of someone who sees a disaster brewing and responds with their first instinct. But what are some of the problems that you guys see with this, with starting to move the boxes out of the way? Stop the water first. Yes, exactly. Lucy, Eleanor, and Lucy and Regina both said, stop the water. You need to turn off the water first. Randall, you can't do it by yourself. The more people you get, the easier this is going to go. Eleanor is right on that this is dangerous. If the water started to pass a live wire, if it started to increase, if she fell and hurt herself, especially if this isn't an easily trafficked area, she could be down here for a while before someone comes and gets her. William has a very specific one. Where do you put them? Which do you move first? What is the order of salvage? Where do you move them to that you don't think the water will increase to? So all of these are great reasons. They're all reasons that I have. No one else knows there's a problem. No one else knows where Alice is. More people makes this go easier. The water hasn't been turned off. That's so huge, because the longer Alice goes, the bigger the problem's just going to get, because more and more is going to keep getting soaked. None of this has been reported to facilities or maintenance. So if there is an order and it's first come, first serve, the longer it takes to report in, the longer it's going to take to get help. And like you guys already said, Alice has put herself at risk. If the water passes a live electric wire or something else, she could be seriously hurt. And people are always most important. So she needs to take steps to protect herself before she starts doing all of these other things. So this is why it's important to have a disaster plan in place before something goes wrong, so everyone can be on the same page. Because that's everyone's first instinct. If we see that things are getting wet, we're going to move them as best we can. But if we have a disaster plan, simply knowing where the stop valves are so that you can stop the flow of water can prevent more water from being discharged and avoid damage to the building, to your materials, or other interruptions to public service. So disaster plans don't have to be expensive. It doesn't cost you really anything except time to go and find out where the stop valves for your library are, but it is critical because it's going to save you a lot of money and time farther down the line. So let's start with some basic terminology and concepts. Let's start with, what is a disaster? What would you guys define as disaster? Flood and fire, yep. As we're going to see, those are two of the biggest ones. Anything that causes extensive damage to the building and or materials, that's a great one. And that's often the definition that gets given, is anything that causes damage, anything that you have to fix. Any more? Yeah, an event that puts building or materials at risk, exactly. So that's a really great definition. Oh, sorry, I thought I heard someone talking for a second. So that's a really great definition. Mine tends to be anything that interrupts day-to-day operations. That's a very sort of an easier bar to hit. You're always going to have things that will interrupt day-to-day operations, but generally anything that makes it so everyone can't work on what they were working on before, that's what I tend to describe as a disaster. But anything that causes damage, that's a great definition too. And my goal in that isn't, okay, now we all have to define exactly what it is and we can't progress. It's just to sort of get you to think about what will you need a plan for and what can people generally handle on their own. So here are some examples, like we said, flooding that can be from rains, rivers overflowing, dams breaking, pipes bursting, typhoons and tsunamis, snowstorms, hurricanes, mold outbreaks, pest infestations, earthquakes, landslides, avalanche, mudslides, volcanic activity, you know, and then you get the man-made ones like arson, theft, active shooter, bomb threat, and many, many more. So obviously some of these are much more serious than others, and not all of them are a threat to your library. So when you make the disaster plan, if you work at ASU or UNCA in the western part of the state, you don't need a tsunami plan. It's okay. It's never going to happen. On the other hand, you probably need a mold plan. That's something that, generally speaking, that could affect anybody and everybody. I'm sorry, I just pulled up the chat and I saw Peter's response. Yes, well, that's also voter registration is underway. You should make sure that you are registered to vote. I am here in Florida currently, so I can't actually help with what North Carolina's systems are, but definitely make sure everyone is registered to vote. Electronic failure of systems is a big one too, especially if there are major power outages across the city, because then it's difficult to maybe get yourself as a priority. So we'll talk a little more about how to narrow down your disaster plans, but just know that it's okay to say, we're only going to focus on a couple things. We're also going to go over what the most common kinds of disasters are. Oh, that's really cool that Chelsea's on your campus. So before I move on to the next slide, does anyone want to guess what the most common disaster the libraries, museums, and archives face is? Eleanor says water. Anyone disagree? Leaky pipes, if not water, then mold. Yep, bugs and mold. Yep, so you guys are all on the right track. Generally speaking, a 2005 study of libraries, archives, and museums, 30% of them said that they had had a disaster in the last 5 years, and 21% of those 30% said that they had suffered more than one. So this is the statistic where it's sort of easy to see why people will push disaster planning to the side. It doesn't even affect a majority of libraries, but when it does affect you, it's important. And like you guys guessed, water damage does account for over half of incidences. So by water damage, I'm including mold and sort of anything in that broad category of a pipe burst to there was flooding from a local river. The next most common is fire damage, and that's usually not even particularly big. It's usually fire damage is pretty easily contained. I don't want to scare anybody. I just, and pests are also I think on this list as well. So the most high profile disasters, the ones that everyone hears about the most on the news and get covered ad nauseum, things like active shooters or rioting, those are often the rarest. And we're going to talk more about plans for those too. It's good to have a plan, but as far as practicing your plan, it's much more likely that water damage is going to be what you actually run into. So that's going to be what our example plan is. So disasters do come in stages. First, there's a warning stage. Generally, most of the disasters that we saw earlier were weather-related, so things like hurricanes, flooding, et cetera, et cetera. If it is a natural disaster, you're probably going to get some warning, and that could be anywhere from weeks in advance to a few days. The Weather Channel says, hey, a hurricane is coming through, and that's the time before the disaster, before it strikes, that you have to prepare things. If you're unlucky, if it's something sudden, it might only be minutes. You might not have any time to prepare, like the burst pipe example from earlier. By the time you find it, you are already during the disaster. So during the disaster, that's when you're following the plan. Well, you should always be following your plan, but that's when you're going to be mainly following your plan. And then aftermath sort of lasts from whenever the disaster is over until normal operations are restored. And these stages are very general, but they give you sort of a guideline for thinking about disasters as they occur. So now that we've talked about what disasters are, I want to talk a little bit about how people behave during disasters. So this is important not just so you know how your patrons are going to respond, but also because more widespread disasters, libraries are often called upon as public service buildings to do things like distribute supplies to the population, particularly for college populations, because college populations do tend to be transitory. You have a lot of people who are not in their hometown, not where they grew up, might have come from out of state, and they're not familiar with the sort of things that you can get. So they are a very hard to help population because they don't have access to local resources. They don't really understand, if you move down to Florida and you've never experienced a hurricane before, and then you hear a hurricane warning, you don't really know how to prepare for that because you've never dealt with it before. It's not in your frame of expertise. So your local college library can be a huge source of comfort and relief during any kind of widespread disaster. So this is the risk information seeking and processing model. It's one of the most commonly referred to models for how people search for information in disasters. So right now, again, what we're talking about is how your patrons or even your staff will look for information during a disaster. So this model is very complicated. It is academic only. We're not really going to worry about it too much right now. I just wanted to show you so you know it exists. This is simplified. So this is what factors go into people's preventative behaviors, what factors go into how people act during a disaster. So you can see on the left, it has individual characteristics. So that's things like age, social status, cultural background, etc. The next one is risk information seeking and processing behavior. So that's how people look for stuff. Where do they look for stuff? And then the last one is the perceived hazard characteristics. So sort of how serious do they think that the disaster is actually going to be? Do they think it's just something that'll blow over and they don't need to prepare for it? Or do they think it's something, huge and major and it's going to, power's going to be out for weeks and we have to get ready now? And all of those combined go into how much people prepare, how they look for information, all of that sort of thing. So of this, what do you think are some of the main factors that go into, sort of within these categories, what do you think are some of the big things that determine why people prepare or don't prepare? Budget and time are both huge, depending on how much time you even realize there is before the disaster. That, if there is no time, then what are you going to do? There is no time. Budget is a huge one, both in what your disaster budget is. So can you afford to buy fresh water for a couple days, et cetera, et cetera? And also budget will determine what sources you have access to. So if you don't have a high-speed internet connection, you can't use the internet to look for things. Past experiences as well is a huge one. And that can be both past experiences from people, from yourself, or from people that you really trust. So generally immediate family or friends. So if you can call a family member who has been through a tsunami, etc., and get advice from them on how to do it, that's huge. So hopefully your patrons have that person that they can ask. Priorities and it won't happen here attitude, both of those kind of go with complacency. A lot of times people who the trick is there's a breaking point where once people get to a certain amount of familiar with a disaster, they're going to stop caring about it. They're going to go, oh, I've lived through hundreds of these. They're not important. This one will be no different and I don't have to prepare. So there is that worry of you want someone who isn't brand new, but you don't want someone who has started to tune out messages. So there is sort of a curve. And when people get too far down the other side of that curve, they will start to, either side of the curve, it's either I have no experience so it doesn't exist, or I have too much experience, I know too much about what's going to happen. And that can also be the risk for disaster plans. If you have staff members who are already very familiar with how disasters go and have been through other library disasters, they can be really valuable, but they can also sort of go, I don't trust your disaster plan. I'm going to do my own. And we'll talk a little more about that later. So generally speaking, people who have when people are in a disaster, you want to give them the information that they actually need rather than what you think that they should know. So that gets into different styles of how people respond during a disaster. So now, as opposed to sort of the patron focus and the individual looking for information, we're going to talk more about your organization providing information during the disaster and the different styles that you can do that with. So the basic point here is give people what they need rather than what you think they should have. So when people are in a disaster, they tend to care about their immediate personal needs. They want to know if their homes are safe, if their possessions are safe, if their family is safe. They want to know if their neighbors are okay. They want to know when basic services will resume. For people who aren't affected by the disaster, they tend to want to know more higher level things, so broad interests, how the disaster has affected crime rates, how public officials are responding. So those sort of broad level things are much easier for organizations to share. And oftentimes organizations will only share that broad level information, or they won't share at all. And that's really a shame, because you miss out on really connecting with people. You know, you can't answer, especially as a library, you can't answer whether or not their homes are safe, but you can give them idea of when your services will resume and, you know, what will you be providing exactly? Do you have computers? Can they use the computers? Do you have up-to-date weather information? Do you have food that you can give out? Even sort of providing these basic level things in a disaster can really increase your trust and really bring people into your library. So here are the models of information seeking, as I mentioned before. Command-oriented approaches look appealing, especially in a disaster. Unfortunately, they rarely work because, unlike law enforcement or the military, there's no real clear chain of command between library and other organizations. And believe me, you will be working with other organizations when a disaster strikes. So if you call maintenance to help you clear up water damage and you treat them like foot soldiers who have to follow your orders, at best, there's going to be bad blood for a while, and at worst, they might leave and go to help someone else who treats them better. So command-oriented approaches also don't take volunteers into account, which we'll talk more about later, but you do need to prepare for the idea that there might be volunteers who are willing to come and help you. So what I recommend is this cooperative approach. It requires way more planning beforehand, I will admit that, but it allows for more flexibility when a disaster actually strikes, because the reality is when something goes wrong, you are going to have to coordinate with other people, and if you've already planned on how to coordinate with other people, it'll make it that much easier for all of you to be ready when something does go wrong, instead of trying to scramble for contacts while the power is out or something similar. So now that we've talked about what disasters are and how people and organizations communicate in disasters, let's get right into how to make a disaster plan. So first, I want to talk about what not to do. So what do you think are some of the most common reasons after the fact that people say that plans failed? No one knows the plan. That's a big one. Either they weren't told a plan exists, so they didn't know where to find it, or they just didn't have the time to look through it. Yeah, they just didn't follow it. And that can be anywhere, again, from they didn't know that it existed to follow it, they couldn't find the information, or they didn't trust it. No response team, so that's a big one. You want to have a team of people who is responsible for responding to the disaster. You don't want to try and divvy up roles based on who's there what day, especially because in widespread disasters, people may be dealing with their own disasters first. Little prior experience, that does tend to be a factor, especially if you haven't worked with your disaster plan before, just because that initial response is that people will sort of panic. The good news is that in a disaster, most people's instincts are good. Studies have shown that when people are in disasters, they don't lose their heads. They're not just going to run around in circles screaming. People will respond based on the limited information they have, and they'll respond well, but that information that they have usually isn't the greatest, and they usually go for what is immediately in front of them. So if you don't have a disaster plan, it'll be like Alice, well, these boxes are getting wet, so I need to move the boxes, but you don't think more wide scale. Yes, build in redundancy because people may not be available for the critical roles necessary. So that's so important. If you build your disaster plan around the idea that your director is going to be the one who takes care of everything and, you know, calls people in to come and fix it, your disaster will take place while your director is on vacation. I can almost guarantee it. You need to be able to have people fill in different roles depending on who is available. So here are some of the examples. The first one is that the most common reason, like we said, is that critical staff wasn't involved and doesn't know the plan exists or doesn't trust it. So when I say critical staff, that means whoever would be responsible for responding to a disaster at any given time. So if your library is only staffed by student workers on the weekend, then your student workers all need to know and trust your disaster plan. If your night manager thinks that the plan was constructed by out-of-touch management, they don't know what the library's really like. I've done hurricanes before. I know how to make it work, and he just decides to do whatever he was going to do anyway, then the plan might as well not exist. You have to get buy-in from all of these people who are going to be actually following out your plan. So this does take a lot of time, particularly if your library has an area with high turnover like student workers. This can be really difficult, and it can be really difficult to train everybody on the new plan, but it is important because you never know who's going to be the one who has to start to follow it. The second and third most common problems are that no one knew where the plan was or no one could find information on it. Your disaster plan should probably be around 2 to 4 pages long. If it's longer, no one's going to be able to find information. If it's an inch thick, no one has time to do that. You want it to be easy at a glance to figure out what you're supposed to do next. Also, as far as knowing where it is, that includes making it accessible. So if everyone knows that the plan is in your office, but you lock your office during the weekends and no one else has the key to your office, no one can get to the plan. So it's a good idea to make copies and distribute them in a couple different places so everyone can find it. The plan is more than 2 years old. Plans do get out of date. They need to be updated. It doesn't allow for absent personnel, like we said. And it wasn't integrated with key organizations with that cooperative style of planning, like we said before. So as far as what to do, one of the first and easiest steps is to get a copy of your building plan. So first you want to go around and find out where all your emergency exits are and make sure that they're not blocked by something. So in one of the places where I used to work, our outdoor exit for the left side of the building, there was an old couch out there that someone had left because it was near to the receiving area, and the smokers, when they wanted their break, would drag the couch in front of the door because they wanted to make sure that no one would interrupt their smoke break. So they would just block the door with the couch. Another common thing is that people will put potted plants in front of emergency exit because it's just a big empty space. It looks so ugly and no one ever uses it anymore. We'll just put a potted plant in front of there. It'll make it look so much nicer. People can just move it out of the way if there's a disaster. You know, it won't be that big a deal. I hate to say it, it is that big a deal. You do need to move your potted plant, put like a picture on the door or something, but make it clear where your exits are and make sure that they're not blocked, please. This is such a common failing that we find, is that your emergency exits, people can't find them or they're blocked. So this is huge. This is possibly one of the most important and easiest things that you can do. Make sure that you mark where your emergency valves are so you can shut water off during an emergency like we already covered. It's also great to know where your controls for the thermostat are so you can control the temperature. That's to deal with mold issues, and we'll talk more about that later. Also, you might want to mark any tucked away rooms that you might need to manually check in a crisis. For example, if your library has any sort of designated study rooms in quiet areas of the library, you shouldn't assume that they can hear the fire alarm if it goes off. So the fire alarms with flashing lights, those are great not just because they're easily visible from a really long distance, and they're also great for deaf and hard of hearing students, but if you can't afford them, make sure that what you already have works. That's much more important. And I will be making a copy of this available afterwards, so don't feel the need to, quickly write everything down as we go. So once you've made sure that your physical space is ready, create a plan of what personnel will do what when. So this can vary really wildly depending on how much staff you have. So I'm just going to give you some ideas on how to generally organize it. So the first is that you can either organize by role, like the bullet points on the left. So one person is team leader and they have a backup. One person is the PR officer and they have a backup. And this is really great because it allows for sort of the flexibility of, well, yeah, that's covered by team leader, so they'll do that if something new comes up. You can also organize by activity, like the bullet points on the right. So this can be a little tougher in an emergency because inevitably something will come up that you didn't think of originally. But if you can get generally sort of wide-ranging activities, like this person is going to be responsible for press releases and communicating. like that can sort of fall under the PR officer, but you know, if they're responsible for this and this and this and this other activity seems to fit within that, then it can be really great. And this can also be really great because it helps people know where to start first. Your plan should always include backup people. Inevitably, someone is going to be on vacation, or if it's a widespread disaster, they may not be able to come into work. They may, you know, their kids may be trapped at the school, and this is the last thing on their mind, and they're trying to get to their family members to make sure that they're okay. So it can be really difficult to volunteer for roles before you've even really that's a great word, before you've even really settled on a plan. So let this be sort of a rough draft where you generally sketch out who your response team is going to be, who the backups are going to be, and you can come back to this later and edit it more as you go on. So once you've organized your own stuff, you should take the time to review your insurance plan and know what it covers, as well as what you need to do to file a claim. So you're almost certainly going to have to call the insurance company at this point, and I know that most people would rather do anything else, but it is really valuable, especially because you can ask questions like, do I need to take pictures of damage in order to document a claim? Do I need to take video? Will you accept a printout of the catalog, or do I need to have a separate list of all the materials? Remember that your insurance adjuster may not be familiar with even the basics of running a library day to day, and you might have to explain, you know, really simple stuff to them. You might have to explain to them what the catalog is or why you need computers. Don't you guys just lend out books? Can't you just write it down? Why do you need computers? So you might have to explain this really basic stuff. If at all possible, ask for an adjuster who specializes in library and archives, but you may not be lucky that you have a company that's big enough that anyone can specialize like that. So if you just do call them ahead of time and explain what your needs are, that's going to be really useful later down the line. So while you're standing in 2 feet of water, you're not trying to explain to them what a catalog is. So doing this ahead of time helps them prepare, and it can also help you prepare, because just like they don't know anything about libraries, you don't have to know anything about insurance. You can ask them, you know, the very basic questions, and most of the time they'll be happy to respond, because it'll make their job a lot easier when you submit your claim if you do everything right the first time. Okay. So there's no insurance company to deal with. It is possible to insure special items. And yeah, if you have any kind of special items, you want to talk about you want to let them know ahead of time what they are, what their needs are. And also we're going to talk about drying companies too. So if your stuff gets damaged by water, you can contract out with a drying company, which is exactly what it sounds like. It'll help you dry your materials. And if you have anything that's fragile, particularly paintings or pre-1950s film, photograph, negatives, etc., those are going to be definitely special items that need to get insured, particularly if they're one of a kind. We will talk more about that too. There's a slide dedicated to it. All right, so within your institution, you want to talk to facilities and maintenance as well as security. Chances are very good that both of these groups already have plans in place, so you want to learn what theirs are before you make yours. You don't want your disaster plans to conflict, and you especially don't want to find that they conflict after something is already happening. For example, does your security team and your facilities team have the keys to every room? Do they know the codes? Do they know updated contact information? Do they know who to call if, say, there's a suspect approaching the library? So you want to make their job as easy as possible. And the good news is, for some of those more high-profile things like rioting, they probably already have a plan in place for that. So you can just use theirs, and that's much easier for everyone involved. They may even already have a contract with a disaster response company, which is what we're going to talk about next. So there are disaster response companies, risk management companies, et cetera, and they generally advertise themselves as, when you get into a disaster, we'll take care of everything for you. The danger with those is that a lot of the times there's no barrier to stop anyone from calling themselves a disaster management company, and you know, it's 2 guys in a van. So you want to check out beforehand if they are legit. So here are some example questions that you can ask, such as, how much do you do yourself? How much do you contract out? What experience do you have with libraries? Can you handle after-hour emergencies? You'd be surprised at how many will say, no, our business hours are 8 to 5. So just be sure. If you want to contract out with them, that's great. If your institution already does, it's almost certainly fine. But if you want to get one just for you, these are some great questions to ask before time. So finally, there's memorandums of understanding that you can have within the community. Has anyone ever written a memorandum of understanding before or been involved in creating? Not for disasters. Okay, so yeah, for more basic things, a lot of people have them for events. I agree to apply. I agree to bring, such and such, and you will bring such and such on this date, and um, we'll all work together. Which is the point of a memorandum of understanding. What it is it's basically a formal agreement that you're going to address, that you both agree to do things in a certain area. And they are very vague because they don't have to be used for disaster planning. So yeah, mutual aid possibilities. This example right here that you see on the screen, this is for 2 libraries that they agree to support each other in a disaster, but it doesn't have to be a library. Depending on your rules, you can create a memorandum of understanding with other people in the community. I will also be upfront that this is going to take a lot of time because you need to identify potential partners and you need to then sit down and talk with them and agree on what their needs are, what your needs are. This is the step that's going to take a lot of time. And if you are stressed for time and you need to create a disaster plan, you need to get one up and running so you can distribute it to staff, this is probably the part that you want to skip. It's really great, a couple years later, if you're going back through your disaster plan and you're going, we should really update this. Why don't we, this works, this doesn't. We have a better understanding of our needs. We can go back in and update this. And it's great to start with, too. The sooner you can get that agreement in place, the better. But if you're really stressed on time, you can skip this step. So now we are going to go through a sample disaster plan. So like I said, we're going to do water damage because that's the most common kind of disaster that most places face. You should think of what type of disasters you're most likely to encounter, and you can keep your plans pretty, not vague, but broad. So things like water damage, fire damage. You don't need to specify, here's what's going to happen in a hurricane. Here's what's going to happen if we do this. Here's what's going to happen if we do that. Because the longer and more complex your plans are, the less likely it is that anyone's going to follow it. So what you want to do is create sort of this solid structure of a plan that can be scaled up if necessary, but it can also be used to respond to, there's mold on 2 shelves. It needs to be something that can be sort of flexible within ranges, and we will talk more about that. So here's an example outline of a plan. So it should start with all the roles of staff members as well as contact information, when to call each person and what to say, especially if they're the insurance adjuster or you need to call security. You want to know what information they will need right off the bat. Next should be a fact sheet that clearly outlines response procedures, including evacuations. And here is where you want to include the building plan that you made earlier that has all the exits, et cetera, et cetera. If part of the procedure is moving materials, you want to consider where you're going to move them to, particularly considering that in wide-scale disasters, the area that you want might not be available. So trying to find an area where you can move, 100 books if you need to, and you can let them all dry and have the space for that, that can be really tough. So this is another time when you want to maybe use your building plan, maybe look at a couple areas near to you and try and find a good area for that. Where your disaster supplies are located. So we're going to talk about that too. Those aren't necessarily expensive things. If you can afford to have a freezer and your drying company says, yes, you can use a freezer for such and such materials, that'd be great. You want to include where your freezer is. If you can't afford a freezer, or your disaster or a drying company says, no, don't freeze your items, and there are some you shouldn't freeze, don't bother. And then lastly, you want salvage priorities like we talked about. So you want to know what's the most important things to go first, and generally that's going to be things that are irreplaceable. Keep in mind that most insurance companies will not cover employees' personal items. So if any reason anybody has anything at their desk that is very rare and irreplaceable, they might want to consider taking it home, or they might want to have it some way addressed that also needs to be moved. So here are examples of water response procedures. Again, it's going to vary by what your collection is. If you're a digital library, you're going to have very different needs. So these first 3 ones are all to do with mold. If you lower the temperatures, increase the airflow, and provide your staff with rubber gloves, boots, and face masks while they're moving things, those are all to keep people safe from mold or to prevent the spread of mold. So these supplies, you can indicate where they are, and they don't have to be expensive. You can buy these things at Walmart. But just make sure that they don't have holes in them. Check them once a year to make sure they're still up to date. Place loose materials under plastic mosquito screening so they don't blow away. Some materials can be frozen to prevent damage. So generally things that you don't want to freeze are any kind of negative, particularly ones from before 1950s. Like I said, they have to be treated immediately for the most part. Paintings, etc. Don't blot your works. If you do that, if someone tries to do that, just leave the paper stuck to whatever it was. Don't try and pull it off. That's going to cause way more damage. And don't attempt to flatten out any works. So when books get wet, they puff up. And if you try and flatten them, it's going to just squish all the pages together and you're never going to be able to unstick them. Also, keep in mind that if your books do get wet afterwards, even when they're dried, they're still going to be puffy. So you might want to talk to your insurance company if you're creating a water response plan about the potential of them being able to give you more shelf space as well, because you're going to need more space for your new giant puffy books. So last step that I'm going to talk, nope, just kidding. So this is another way to structure your plan. So this is an example of a timeline. So within the first 24 hours of a disaster, you're going to want to do X, Y, and Z. So remove all the affected material from the space. Within 48 hours, you're going to want to do this. Within 72 hours, you're going to do this. So this is just another way to structure it instead of maybe having like the salvage procedure or the evacuation procedure. You can combine those with this. You can use these in any way you like. You can add more levels. You can take more levels away. You can have different lengths of time. And this is a great way to help keep people focused and help keep everyone on the same page as they work, because people will tend to go for whatever is nearest to them, whatever problem immediately presents itself. This can help keep everyone focused on what's more important. And generally you want your plan to end with, and here's how we're going to resume normal operations. So this is the last step we're going to talk about is volunteers. You kind of want to at least anticipate that you might get volunteers. People really love their libraries, and if they realize that you need help, you would be surprised at how many people will come out. Having said that, especially if you want to do wide-scale planning, you don't want to give volunteers crucial roles because no one might show up because they're too busy worrying about their homes. So if at all possible, identify areas in your disaster plan where you could send volunteers. And you want to also coordinate this with other agencies. So security, they're probably not going to want any volunteers, but facilities might. Or if you have a memorandum of understanding with someone else in your community, they might be interested in, oh, well, we could use volunteers for here. And if you do it ahead of time, you're not sending off different people and, 2 people come to volunteer and they get separated for the whole day. You can keep people together in groups and you can have everybody work on one thing so it'll get done much quicker. So I'm going to end my presentation here.